All right, welcome everyone. Let's try to kick this off so we stay on schedule. We've got a little script here. It says, welcome to this highly anticipated HAI research seminar. I'm blank, but I can fill that one in. I'm Chris Potts, and it really is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jared Moore. I have some things that I want to say about Jared, but before I do that, I just want to offer a few logistical notes. For our online attendees on Zoom, feel free to use the chat for general messages, but please direct your questions through Slido. And look out for the Slido link in the chat shortly. Someone else is going to share that. We'll be using Slido's handy upvote feature to prioritize questions that catch everyone's interest. And don't worry, we'll make time for both our virtual and live audiences during the Q&A session after Jared's talk/reading. And then, without further ado, let's turn our attention to this esteemed speaker. So here's where I want to go off script and just say, I'm delighted that Jared is a member of the Stanford NLP group. He's a PhD student here in computer science. And of course, Jared is doing the hard technical work that you would expect of someone in the NLP group at Stanford, really pushing the limits of what we can do with NLP technologies and AI technologies. And that's all wonderful. But for me, Jared's work really stands out for being interdisciplinary in some special ways. Jared is really looking for ways to collaborate between the computer science side of this and philosophers and cognitive science and scientists and so forth. I think he's really interested in kind of general questions of what it would mean for any agent to perceive or understand or be conscious. And in that context, we're kind of seeing an interplay between the technological side of AI and the philosophical and societal questions that all of us are increasingly confronting. And it's really wonderful to have people operating at this boundary as these technologies become more ubiquitous, having people like Jared there to interpret between fields and help us understand those deep questions seems incredibly important. I also want to mention that Jared and I have a new paper, and the focus of this paper is a data set that we call I Am a Strange data set. And the purpose of this data set is really to push the limits on what language models of today can do when it comes to metalinguistic reasoning and kind of metacognition. And for I Am a Strange data set, the problems are fun and pretty easy for most humans. Jared created a subset of this data set that he called I Am an Impossible data set. And these are questions that are so confusingly self-referential that almost no agent who isn't Jared can do them at all. And I really like this because this is an instance of Jared, I think, really pushing toward the future. People can solve the basic data set, language models struggle. Every agent, as far as we know, struggles with I Am an Impossible data set, except, as I said, for Jared. And I think this is apt because really what we see running through all of Jared's work is pushing the limits of helping us see what the future is going to be like. And one thing that is, again, special about Jared's contributions here is that he's helping us see the future through technological contributions at the level of basic AI research, but also I think sees that one way we might really glimpse the future and the problems that we're going to pose is through creative expression. And so Jared has pursued that with various kinds of artistic work, and also, of course, with this new book, The Strength of the Illusion. And so that's a perfect moment for me to hand this over to Jared so that we can all get a glimpse of the present and near future as Jared imagines it. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jared.
Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me? I might be talking a little too loud. Chris is making me wonder if there's somebody else named Jared who should be coming up here and beginning to talk. That praise was so effusive. I really appreciate it. Let me attempt to hold a candle to that introduction. As Chris said, my name is Jared. I'm a PhD student here. I study social common sense. How can we get ChatGPT to do the right thing? Before this, I was a lecturer at the University of Washington. I taught classes on the philosophy, math, and ethics of AI. But like Chris said, this isn't going to be a very technical discussion. I write plenty of boring, jargon-filled papers and give very dry academic talks. You can come to those if you would like instead. I'm going to do a couple of readings from my book, and then we'll take questions at the end, as Chris said. OK. The clicker is working. So this is the cover of the book that I wrote and that we're going to be talking about. You can buy it actually in the back if you're curious. Cut that. And it's my motivation in writing this book was very much along the lines of what Chris said. I want to think about creative expression, and I want to think about how is it that our creations change the world. Our artistic creations, like a book, but also the creations technologically. And that world is both the world of literature, the world that we inhabit, the world of the future. What kind of future are we making? And is this the future that we necessarily want? These are the questions which really undergird the work that I'm looking at today. I might rephrase those questions in a different way to ask, what is real? What is real about what we're making? What's the signal behind the noise? And what is illusory? I try to do this in the book. I'm not going to talk so much about the narrative today, but the book itself follows a startup employee named Ty, who joins a startup called Opal that makes a machine that can write. Big surprise, it's kind of like ChatGPT. Opal wants to bring on-demand literature to the masses, commercialize the product, push as far as they can. But Ty isn't so sure. At home with his radical partner, they wonder whether they are working on the right kind of future. As his partner encourages him to protest against big tech, Ty increasingly turns to the machine that he's making itself, typing into the terminal and sort of losing himself in the machine. But today I'm going to focus on the ideas behind the book instead of on the narrative in particular. I'd like to start with a reading, and then I'll emerge some themes from there. So this is where I do the reading. For those of you who have the book, I'm reading starting on page 11. It was like writing in a manner of speaking. Or, as our tagline went, it did as much for thinking as the dishwasher did for cleaning. The new service we developed at Opal allowed those of us with resources to explore, to opine, and to transcribe the thoughts that we all had locked up in our minds, but were unable to access. All of us have artistic tendencies. There's an essayist inside of everyone. It was a process for which we at Opal charged a simple subscription fee. With a ghostwriter, anyone could author a book, pen a memo, or write so smooth and trochee iambs and anapest and whatever metrical foot, without having to go through the mind-numbing process of actually writing, of pausing during their day to think before saying, or of playing editor much earlier than one really should. There were endless such decisions, enough to block the best of us. It could be exhausting to decide. So we did it for you. At Opal, blocked writers were one of our first target audiences. Then, as that one audience became many, we began to make grand claims. We began to think of ourselves as saviors of a dying republic. We would help local communities rival the importance of large ones. In my time, we heard about filter bubbles, worried about restrictions on free speech, and designed new technologies to fix the effects of old ones. But change wasn't as hard as some thought. Gradual progress wasn't necessary. There was a technical solution. While liberals looked to authoritarianism to beget their utopian dreams, we authoritarians looked to liberalism for ours. At Opal, our tools would cut through bureaucratic glut, encourage autonomy, and bolster human well-being. Then the marketplace of ideas would balance out. That was democracy. With Opal at the helm, the future would sound good. We were the digital camera of writing. We democratized literature. We were the high-keyed colors, natural harmony, and brinksmanship of abstraction. We had discovered the notion of turning to literature to discover new mathematical and scientific structures. It's cheap to say that all we wanted was the money. It's false that all we wanted to do was nobly explore the endless frontier of science. We would make the most money and the largest advancements to science at the same time. There had to be some optimal arrangement of people, and there had to be some optimal tech to ease any friction between them. That's what it means to be optimal. But for some reason, the rest of the world outside of the American West Coast didn't take kindly to our solutions, which claimed that morality and emotions worsened outcomes. For whatever reason, people still wanted a human to make decisions for them. Where did they get off? Really, what kind of algorithm was it that would give different answers to the same input, even if that algorithm ran in human minds? Uncontrolled randomness. Noise explained it. Lived experience, as I thought back then, was just another term for untranslatable nonsense. Hell, we could even program such blockheadedness into our products. As with our competitors, we'd written an ethics review board in as a line for our publicity budget. That way, we didn't even consider most of the bad use cases, which might have been possible, because what was bad for our conscience was bad for business. Of course, having open sourced much of our technology, we necessarily opened the door for the less scrupulous to do what they would with our tools. But that wasn't our problem. After all, we were all about freedom. The marketplace of ideas would drown out all of the haters. Our workplaces were melting pots, the pinnacle of rewarding. They were fun. Diversity, whether in hiring practices, software, or ways of thought, made for great sound bites and kept retention of top talent high. We really did care about the pipeline problem. Wages were too darn competitive, and why we had to be so much nicer than big oil. It was those positive aspects we evangelized at far-flung conferences in order to swipe from other groups the human products of nature's most stochastic reward systems. After all, the immigrant story showed us that nothing but merit and grit determined who ended up getting an advanced degree. Nonetheless, all that talk about progress and diversity remained chiefly inside our workplaces. The transformation and fun didn't translate well into the products we made. Sure, millions of commoners got fat off our stash, but they didn't get to be living the sort of reimagined existence that we professionals did. It's not that our big ideas weren't true, just that bigness came with a price. Ideally, one paid in annual installments. All right. Given that this is a cutting-edge talk about AI and technology, we're obviously going to start drawing out themes with some crusty old 18th century philosophers. In 1759, the social critic Voltaire authors Candide, which is an instant hit satirizing life at the time, and in particular the ideas of his contemporary Leibniz and the ideology of utilitarianism. Among a variety of other things, Leibniz co-invented the calculus with Newton. At the time, both Leibniz and Voltaire were specifically focused on this problem, which they called the problem of evil. Given in their belief that there is an all-knowing and all-powerful God, how is it that bad things can happen in the world? The Lisbon earthquake had just happened, a lot of people had died. We weren't sure. Why is God letting these things happen? This is the problem of evil. More on that in a moment. The parallels between Candide, the novella, and today are quite legion. Candide, who's the protagonist in the novel, is this sunny, gullible character who's easily led astray by his foil, the other character, Dr. Pangloss. Pangloss in Greek means all language, think language models. Despite this, Leibniz, in response to the problem of evil, had been arguing the reason that bad things happen in this world is because this is the best of all possible worlds. Given that God is all-powerful, he would have put us in a better world if possible. We're in this one, therefore, this must be the best world possible. Voltaire thought this was a little bit silly, and that's what the novella is about, expulcating this theme. So on the journey through the novella, Dr. Pangloss and Candide witness a variety of horrors. Through this time, Dr. Pangloss remains convinced that his philosophy is correct, that we're in the best of all possible worlds, but Candide increasingly grows disillusioned. What I want to say here is that there's a similar kind of myopia going on, a similar kind of big picture being missed, and I hope to draw that out throughout the remainder of the talk. But on this problem of evil, the reason that it failed, the reason that Leibniz's solution didn't work, and indeed also why Voltaire's commentary was unreasonable, is that it wasn't a problem that needed to be solved. The idea of the problem of evil is illusory. There isn't an omnipotent and omniscient God that could have put us in a different possible world. There isn't a problem to be solved here. This, by the way, is a rendition of Dr. Pangloss and Candide done by Paul Klee around 1912, 1920, TBD. So this discussion of Candide and Pangloss brings me to the subject of illusions, which will be the remainder of the talk today. Illusions are not unreal. They're not lies. Rather, illusions are things that are not as they appear to be. So for example, those of you sitting in the back right might be able to distinguish the object in the bottom of this frame, not as being some kind of contorted black and white object, but rather as being a skull. around the time that Hans Holbein the Younger painted this portrait in 1533, optics was really hot research. How does perspective work? What is happening? Artists at this time were pushing the boundaries of what is taken to be perspective. And indeed, there's a long history in the visual arts and art in general in uncovering illusions, in attempting to approximate reality, challenging our preconditions, our precognitions. And so inspired by this trend in visual art, I'm led to ask, what kind of illusions have current science, not optics in the case of Hans Holbein the Elder, but the science of AI, what illusions have large language models uncovered? What can they teach us about our current age? And I think there's one illusion that's fairly clear, which we can talk about for a moment. Namely, it's the illusion that up until the past couple of years, we thought that to understand language, to speak fluently, you had to have either some strict internal logical grammar or something along those lines, or to have experiences, to have a body, have a variety of the traits that we associate with ourselves. But this isn't the case. That idea is illusory. Large language models like ChatGPT show us that the gears of language can churn away on their own, sort of like watching salts crystallize, that there are kind of universals at work in how language is constructed and used. This is pretty startling. Many of us, when we first saw ChatGPT, might have felt a bit of that surprise. Yes, there are undercurrents in usage-based linguistics in the end of the 20th century, but many people didn't know about this. It can be kind of alarming. We might think about AI systems developing competencies beyond language. We can think of AI safety as naming some of those concerns. But a little bit more trivially, a little bit more personally, this prominence of language ability cuts me down to size a bit. I'm a guy who likes to think that he's good at language, who speaks well. I wrote a book. And when I see large language models like ChatGPT, it challenges my verbal prowess. It makes me wonder whether I'm actually such a big talker as I imagine that I am. But on reflection, I actually think that this negative interpretation is wrong. And I want to explain this by way of an example. Here, let me set up the example. In the mid-19th century, realist painting was dominant. People like John Constable were trying to paint clouds as accurately as possible. They were trying to depict nature exactly as it was. But in response to this, into realism, impressionists like Claude Monet thought that something was missing from the depictions. Monet led the impressionists to focus not on depicting the object exactly, but rather to show the image on the retina, to show reality as it was perceived. And this was a pretty major turn. Here we see three different images of the Rouen Cathedral painted in the 1890s, which are in many respects totally different. If you were a realist, you should be saying, like, this is the same cathedral. Why is it different colors? There's something wrong with this image. But what Monet was doing is he was showing the cathedral as it appeared in, like, on the left, a very strong sunlight as the boundaries begin to shimmer, in sunset on the right, and in a kind of dim daylight in the middle. Paul Cézanne, who's a contemporary impressionist of Monet, gives him a bit of a backhand compliment for his role in really establishing impressionism. He says that Monet is only an eye, he says this in French, but what an eye? What Cézanne is saying here is that Monet is great, but it's not really his skill that's special. He's just painting what he sees. What's special is that he knew to do this. And I imagine there's actually a corollary with regard to the prominence of language models today. It's something like, it's just a linguistic gearbox, but what a gearbox. And I can think about the same thing for myself. Like, my verbal, like, it's just verbal prowess, but isn't that cool? it lets me reframe linguistic performance as a sort of illusion. It's not something special per se, unattainable, necessarily what makes us unique. Our minds are suites of mental faculties. They're inbuilt Swiss Army knives. And I think that we can appreciate them for what they are without having to have that deflationary moment, like I mentioned just a moment ago. Stepping back a moment, you might be wondering, this is a talk about AI, but this guy keeps showing us paintings. When is he going to come out and say that all of these were generated by stable diffusion? I thought that art was dead, that it was being replaced by image models. I don't think so. That's why I'm showing these images. My point in showing these images is that the history of art, particularly of visual art, is also a history of perception and of illusion, and that we can draw on that history to tell us things. It's fun to uncover illusions. It's surprising, it's interesting and beautiful in many of these paintings, but it chiefly is instructive. It tells us about things that we did not realize before. This is one of the more prominent visual illusions depicted by Magritte in the early 20th century. And he says something that a somewhat subtle point here. It translates as, this is not a pipe. We have grown up in a very imagetic mode of thinking. We associate the image of an object with the object itself. This is neither a pipe, nor is it a painting. This is I don't know, like 12 different screens, which in composition make us think that it is a pipe and painting. I am not my Instagram profile. I am not my CV. I'm not even my name. I'm just the bundle of atoms who's up here changing, sending waves through the air to affect the cilia in your ears. And it takes some revolutionary artists to remind us of this and to teach us this. Drawing from that tradition, I might say that the past century, we've really been speeding up the naming of illusions. And I'm going to name a couple of them because they're quite prominent in my book. One of them is time and space. We used to think that they were less flexible than they are now. And then the physicists taught us that space can bend, that everything is energy, and in a certain sense. Another illusion, which is brought about, or we can reflect on from ChatGPT, is the singularity of authorship. We think that one person writes a book, has an idea, etc. This is also an illusion. I have lifted my talk from a variety of other people. I have lifted my language from all of the people that teach me the language to this date. Language models show that all of us have been plagiarizing each other just a little bit. The trouble with them is they're just too good at remembering. We have a lossy enough memory that it seems like there's something different going on. Another illusion that I play with in the book is narrative. When we read a book, we identify with the characters. We're sad when they die. We think that something good should happen to them. But there are no characters. There is just the idea that we have that there are characters. This is also an illusion. The stories are not true. The characters don't exist. Which brings me to an illusion which Chris brought up in the beginning, of consciousness. For a long time throughout history, we have thought that there is some ethereal plane in which our souls reside, that somehow we are separate from the leaky bags of charged fluid, our neurons, which compose us, which are us. There's no movie going on in your brain. There's no tiny homunculus sitting in and controlling the gears. Consciousness is a sort of self-narrative, which is not quite unlike the attribution of experiences to the characters of a novel, although I have more thoughts on it than just that. The last illusion which I would like to name, which is going to follow us through the remainder of the talk, is the notion of progress. Namely, the idea of progress as never-ending exponential growth. We've probably heard things like this, seen the hockey stick charts. We only need to look at population curves to see that never-ending exponential growth ends up looking a little bit more sinusoidal in most natural systems. I'm not trying to say that these 5 illusions, which I named, progress, consciousness, narrative, singular authorship, are fake. I'm not trying to say that we need to give up the ghosts on them necessarily. It's just that we're increasingly realizing that these things are not as they seem, that they are illusory. There's something more going on. And in response to this, there are a few questions which tug at me, particularly with regard to AI. They're the questions that we often maybe touch on in rooms like this, in universities like this, but I feel we don't ever fully address head on. Namely, how are we different than AI systems? I mentioned these Swiss Army knives of cognition previously. Is ChatGPT meaningful? Could some AI be conscious? And the second question is that, what happens when we wed ourselves to the tools we poorly understand? What do we become? Individually, what happens to me as a writer? As a species, what happens to us? And when asking these two questions, what I really want to know, but I just can't quite figure out, is am I making the same faulty assumptions that Leibniz and Voltaire did in naming this as a problem? Perhaps I'm simply misguided in asking these. I will abstain on answering that question for the moment and simply name these questions as the problem of meaning instead of the problem of evil, as Voltaire and Candide were discussing. I don't want to just discard these questions about conscious AI systems or rogue AI systems as too fringe, too weird. There's serious work to do on these subjects. Many of my colleagues do that kind of work. But I also think that there's room for a healthy skepticism to doubt some of our preconceptions. I do this work academically, philosophically, computationally, and these approaches work only so well, unfortunately. You see, part of the enigma in critiquing the study of language and critiquing the dominant methods in AI right now is that we have to do so through language. Language is the medium of our expression. And so I'm left feeling like I must attempt to break the language, to push it beyond its boundaries, to play with illusion and reality, much like many of these visual artists have done. Not compute some kind of average of a population's utterances, but to do something new. That's what I attempt to do with this book. What I think that we need to do as a field, and I think it's somewhat of a call to action for all of you, to figure out what is not known yet. It's what makes art worthwhile, I think, what makes life worthwhile. And so I would actually like to turn this question over to you for just a moment. And for those of you online, this might be kind of difficult, but we'll see. I would like to ask you, what's an illusion that you encounter? We've seen a lot of examples of illusions before. Think to yourself for a moment, what's an illusion that you encounter? And then let's take, you see, I'm an instructor. I can't help but use pedagogic tools. Take a moment and share the illusion with somebody sitting nearby you. I'll have 30 seconds and then start again. Okay, take a moment to wrap up. All right, I'm gonna start again. If we could try to quiet down. If you like activities like this, by the way, I'm hopefully teaching a class next year, so you could just all enroll in that if you want to hear me gab away more and more. Okay, so I'm going to keep going with the talk. I have the illusion of control, as Chris is saying. Yeah, absolutely. It was broken, and now I have to regain it. I'm attempting to think about what the illusions in artificial intelligence are right now. There's this problem of meaning, which I'm obsessed with. And so, like the lazy grad student that I am, I'm putting my feet up, I'm chewing on my pencil, staring out the window instead of doing actual work. And I'm wondering, how do I keep up with the pace of the field? Things are just moving so fast. The Twitter fire hose is impossible to keep up with. What's real? Like, what's going to last in all of this noise? This is kind of like a painter who is passed in an instant by a blur of steel and sweat rolling down the road, trying to ask, what is the essence of a cyclist? This is what Boccioni does. Umberto Boccioni offers one attempt in the early 20th century depicting a cyclist, which I think is kind of interesting depiction of a cyclist, very pretty. This is also like a physicist who's trying to uncover the truth of matter behind all of the whizzing of particles. And in this process of asking what is real and attempting to figure out this signal behind the noise, I can't help but fixate on one constant behind a lot of the commotion in AI right now. It's one we, I think, overlook at our far-flung conferences. People. In particular, there's one kind of person, one persona in AI, which I can't quite get my head around, and which I am attempting to work through in this book. It's what I might call the ideology of technology supremacism. I don't quite understand it. And so what I would like to do in this next reading is offer one of my attempts to do so. And for context, you'll remember that the main character is speaking, Ty. He works at this company, Opal, and Ben is the name of the CEO of the company. So I'm going to start on page 120. I knew what Ben meant. I hadn't been long from such opinions myself. We professionals were the people inventing the future, those who thought themselves brutally honest, in need of only respect and results. Not love. We were true to the facts. We wouldn't be caught dead being seen as a victim. Still, I thought, we were also hurt little kids in need of a hug. Our childhood spent learning to predict scorn instilled in us the anxious disposition to view events in the most logically pessimistic light possible. That is what the behaviorist John Watson desired when he advised that parents never hug and kiss your children, never let them sit in your lap. So what of fatherly love? Ben might have asked. He had a much better shaped reward signal than quality time with dad. His best work had more citations than that of his father, by a factor of at least 100. In somewhat more specific reporting on our boys, I have heard said that these are the casualties of the spirit, the troubled in mind, men who are damaged emotionally. Indeed, dissociation between self and soul is all too much a fact of war, but it also appears, in a less pronounced way, to be all too much a fact of maleness. Now, there are some who say there is no escaping war as there is no escaping maleness. I, on the other hand, am quite skeptical of a priori truths. All too much a fact today may yet be none too true tomorrow. Perhaps we will be done with wars when we are done with the silence over things half remembered. So be wary of men and their promises of freedom, from toil, from want, or from feeling. They cannot admit to even themselves the costs to incur in their flights from the past. I realized that I wanted to ask Ben something, him that stand in for all of the tight-lipped people I'd known. I realized that I needed a partner, like many of the insecure middle-agers in the profession, so that I could have some way to share emotionally without the appearance of weakness. Thus, I realized the one I really wanted to ask was not Ben, but rather was my second-person self. I wanted to ask, why do you think that you need to succeed? Tell me, were there times that you were happy as a child? Times when you felt safe? Notice, if you would, how those memories sit in your body. Notice how they make you feel. I'm projecting here, but I wonder the degree to which that child continues to dictate your current actions. I thought, I wonder how those feelings inform your relationships, whether those are relationships with people or with constructions. I can only imagine that Ben would think I was stupid for thinking that way, for talking to myself, more or less. I knew he wouldn't let me get away with unempirical enjoyment. As I heard Ben launch into his next admonishment, I wondered how he thought about himself. We pursued scientific knowledge, that will-o-wisp, that reductive series of explanations, because we had not learned to pursue anything else. In comparison, the everyday facts of life, of group dynamics, or of social cues were too boring, too simple, and of too little importance. After all, as Wolff said, a nose can only be cut off in one way and mated and lost in another. We sought to describe life, not realizing that to live it was an optimization problem, just as many ups and downs. You see, one should begin with the simplest explanation of thought, of intelligence, and then, through trial and error, add complexity. It was more important to learn quickly than to learn well. I saw it in Ben. I found it in myself. We wanted to chunk the world. We humans had evolved to seek out higher order patterns to make memory tasks easier. It just made sense, therefore, that we could describe the world simply. If our explanations weren't simple, or simple enough that we could understand them, what was the point of explaining? Let me attempt to summarize that passage in a parable. A man promises to fix the urgent problems of today without undue disruption, if only we give him free rein and more money. What could go wrong? We need not look any farther than last week's papers to see this happening in AI. Let me paraphrase a prominent executive. We need to spend whatever it takes. It's AGI. Billions, maybe trillions. Part of me thinks, gee, well, maybe they'll have some money to let me chew on my pencil and stare out the window. I'm an academic. I like grants. But then I remind myself, I'm in this field for the ideas, not for the money. And this idea, this accumulationist focus on money, is not new. Marvin Minsky, one of the founders of AI, got a lot of money from Jeffrey Epstein. We long ago gave up the ghost on taking money from the surveillance capitalists like Google, Facebook. However hippie we want to think that California was in the 60s and 70s, it's military industrial contracts that made this valley and this university the place that it is. We can use this history of AI to bear on its present. And in so doing, what I want to say is that the will to power, oftentimes, not ideals, drives AI. The dominant view, the popular view, treats AI systems as instruments of control, of accumulation. Of course, many of us researchers buck this trend, not trying to castigate us. We speak of risks of AI. We apply AI to good ends, and we pursue curiosity and not capital. But the possible uses of the systems we make vastly outstrip the expected usage. It wasn't long after we learned how to disambiguate dog breeds with image models that we were deploying them to target enemy combatants. It wasn't long after we learned how to generate convincing text that we had internet cowboys having language models execute code, generate misinformation, do spear phishing. Greed and haste, inflamed with the accelerant of AI, make for bellicose companions. And so I mull over this outlook of technology supremacism. It makes me wonder, what's missing? Does anyone know this painting, by the way? Don't say it out loud if you do. But take a moment to look at it. I think it should be big enough. There's a characteristic feature in this painting that once you recognize it is the one thing that you would say about it. This is kind of like the game in the newspaper. What's out of place? Just raise your hand if you think you know what it is. I'm not going to call on you. I'm just trying to get a sense. Okay, we have a couple. Try to look maybe in this bottom right quadrant if there's anything in particular that's striking or a characteristic about the painting. I'm gonna give it up now. This painting is called "Landscape with the Fall of Icarus." You can see Icarus here in the bottom right, his legs sticking out of the water, drowning. It's a pretty painting, painted by maybe Bruegel the Elder in the late 16th century. Let me go over the story of Icarus. His father, Daedalus, built the labyrinth on Crete for King Minos to imprison the Minotaur, but Minos was pretty evil, also imprisons Daedalus, and in order to escape, Daedalus and his son Icarus don these wings attached with beeswax, and they're going to fly off of Crete and escape. But Daedalus tells his son one thing, or two things, when flying. Don't fly too close to the ocean, because the mist is going to dissolve the wax, and don't fly too close to the sun, because the sun is going to melt the wax. Icarus flies too close to the sun. Many people, in response to this, think, Icarus, what an idiot. He shouldn't have done that. It's a story about hubris. But I actually think we can take a different interpretation. Let's give him a break, and let's think about how we're using this new tech of wings to solve this old problem created by labyrinths. We're trying to solve technological problems with new technological problems. In other words, what I think that the myth of Icarus does for us is that it shows how some of our default modes of looking at technology fail us. To draw that out, like in any good talk about technology, I think we need to go back and start with an Abrahamic God, which I will do on the next slide. This is another quiz. Does anyone know where this is? Can show of hands, a couple of us maybe. You're going to recognize the next zoomed in image for sure. This is the fresco on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, painted in the early 16th century. And this, you have definitely seen, is Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam. You have God over here on the right. He's making Adam in some kind of way. But I actually think it depicts more than the creation of Adam. This isn't a new thought, plagiarism, remember? Does anyone recognize a particular structure that might be enveloping God? There's a certain lobe object, which many of us, most of us, all of us have, the brain. God's legs are kind of the brain stem. His arm is reaching over the frontal lobe. Many scholars have commented on how this may not just depict the creation of Adam, but also the creation of intelligence more generally. And it's that creation of intelligence which I would like to focus on. I'm going to name this the biblical narrative of artificial intelligence, which I think is a kind of outgrowth of this view of technology supremacy. And I'll summarize it with a paraphrase of Genesis, again, like any good AI talk. Let us make AGI in our image, according to our likeness. Where our here does not mean everyone. Like these paintings, it means like white Europeans or something along those lines. It means those in power, those in control of the narrative. And our likeness might mean the kind of ways that those people in power, imagine AI systems going. You might be thinking, is this really true? It can't be that AI systems are actually hearkening back to creation myths like this speaker is doing. But indeed, you can look to a call for funding from a prominent philanthropic foundation with many associations with this university, which uses this quote from John Maynard Keynes from the mid-20th century. Keynes said that, thus, for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem: how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him, to live wisely, agreeably, and well. I mean, that would be great. If I could just loaf around all day, like I said, I'm a lazy grad student, that would be good for me. But I wonder whether this is the problem that we're really solving, whether this is the future which will necessarily result. It's not like I think it's impossible that we automate all work or something along these lines. It's not that I think that there shouldn't be people who work on those problems. It's just that I worry that this discussion of the automation of all work makes us lose sight of the present moment. The industrialists thought that we would be free from all work as well. But somehow I'm still answering email late at night, doing things on the weekend. Just because we have made new systems does not mean that the capital system will have no more use for us. And this isn't new in the history of technology. When Samuel Morse was laying the telegraph lines from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, in 1844, the message that they first sent across the wire, this is also apocryphal, they tested it many times, but the message they claimed in the newspapers they first sent across the wire was, "What hath God wrought?" Look at the kind of systems which we are creating here. So when interrogating the idea of let us make AGI in our image according to our likeness, I name the creation myth of AGI, which is an illusion, much like the creation of Adam. It never happened. It's not as it seems. Creation myths are a tired way of looking. We might also recognize and think that artists channel the divine. Michelangelo, for example, was commissioned by the church to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But even the creation of Adam was not as transcendent as some of us might think. It was quite uncomfortable for Michelangelo to probably supervise the work happening at the top of that chapel. It lasted 4 years. And indeed, he writes to a friend of his at the time, saying, "I've already grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a cat in Lombardy." A goiter is a kind of protrusion of the neck. And I don't know about you, but AGI feels a little bit less divine in the day-to-day to me. I might say something like, "I've already grown carpal tunnel from this torture, coding like a monkey here in Silicon Valley." Which brings me back to illusions. An illusion is not a lie. It's just that things are not as they seem to begin. And uncovering illusions, replacing tired old ones with newer ones, implies a freshness, something revelatory without religion, not sure. And I would challenge us to do the same with the output of language models, with the next systems which we all create. I think the joy is in the interpretation. Like I said, with uncovering the illusion of understanding, what's there is for us to discover. We ought to see the figure in the clay, like Michelangelo said. He said that every block of stone has a statue inside of it, and it is the task of the sculptor to discover it. So as we set about unpacking the illusions of the past, I encourage us to be more plural in the likenesses that we imagine for AI systems. Let's have a little bit more nuanced future. Let's get rid of some of these tired ideas. I mean, after all, we were so surprised when ChatGPT learned how to use words, but it's really surprising that children use words, that I use words. It's kind of mind-boggling when you really think about it. I think that this is how art will respond to AI systems, with novelty. Artists, creative thinkers, also in the sciences, are not averages of the population. They push the boundaries. Which brings me to the almost last slide of my talk. AI has always been about to change the world. In 1956, when the Dartmouth conference happened, which many claim is the beginning of AI, they thought they would get plenty of work done in a summer. We're saying it again. We're saying that AI is going to change the world. It will change the world. It has changed the world in many ways. I just don't know if it's going to do it in exactly the ways that we are saying right now. And furthermore, I'm no more convinced that we have thought through the implications of what we're doing than ever. Why do I tell you this? You're the people who are trying to do something about AI. We're in HAI, we're at Stanford. I'm not trying to say that you should be doomers and blow up data centers, that you should stop working on the systems that you're doing. After all, like Chris said in the beginning, I do plenty of technical work on AI systems. Personally, I'm just looking to keep two things straight. I want to recognize the inherent limits of my work with respect to the broader political systems and the history of artificial intelligence. I want to resist this creation myth of AGI, which is brought upon the view which I identify as technological supremacism. But at the same time, I don't want to just be critical. I want to, number two, continue my own research and stoke the curiosity that I feel, the joy I feel in creation, that there's something new to be found. I want to figure out if the problem of meaning is really a problem that we should be going after, to dissolve it. And today, what I'm attempting to do is share a little of what I have learned and how to balance these two approaches to distinguish illusion from reality. You see, I was a bit disillusioned before I started this book in thinking about AI ethics and AI research. I kept flipping between utopias and dystopias. I was led astray by the siren calls of illusions. We must not just critique the systems that we're working on, but also create beauty in what we do. What I'm not sure yet about is how we do so. So what is real in AI systems and what is illusory is up to us to find out. It's like what Candide says to the optimism of Pangloss at the end of Voltaire's novella. He says, "We must cultivate our gardens." Here is one, not garden, but natural landscape, painted by John Constable, one of the people Claude Monet was kind of railing against with Impressionism. It's very pretty, I think, but it's also illusory. If you go to Wivenhoe Park in the west of England, where this was actually painted, the house is actually not where it seems. The colors don't quite work right, but it's a nice image. It's one that I like to look at. And this leads me to ask one more thing of you, being, how do you find joy in what you do? Think about this for a second. And then, like last time, I'll give us 60 seconds, or maybe a bit more than 60 seconds. I'll ask you, share this with the person sitting next to you or near you, maybe a different person if you can. Okay, I'm going to start trying to wrap up your conversations. Okay, I'm going to start talking again. I'm glad that you're continuing to talk. It makes me feel that this room is joyous, or something along those lines. But at last, I must staunch your joy and continue talking. If I was in class, I would ask you to popcorn style share some of these things. You'd have to feel like you're a college undergraduate again. Alas, I don't have the time for that. What I can say is that, again, kind of selfishly, I found a lot of joy in writing this book. You can buy it on the back table. And I also wanted to note that the cover is actually an illusion. It's a kind of binocular rivalry illusion. I have these red and green glasses here, which you can see on the website. That one image is only seen using each of the different lenses. I had to do this. I was following in many lines of illusions to make this. I would also like to note that not only was my book scooped by ChatGPT, which came out while I was writing the book, but also my cover was scooped by Facebook threads. So I've been scooped by many people, which I appreciate. The book has many other illusions, not just the cover, littered throughout. That's kind of why I chose illusions as the subject of this talk. I encourage you to find them. Email me if you think that you have. And if you would like me to give a talk like this to your group, please reach out, which is all I have to say for today. So thank you.
All right, so we have time for questions. There are some on the iPad here, but I think we could start with people in the room. I see a hand in the back there.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. So you talk about illusion today, and I wonder what's your perception of reality? Is illusion a kind of reality? Is there anything that's real? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your question. So the question's about does reality exist? Something like that. Yeah, reality exists. I'm not trying to say that illusions mean that the world is a lie. It's just that things are not as they seem. They definitionally can't be how they seem. We have to interact with the world through our bodies, which distort the world. But there's something there. It's a matter of figuring that out, approximating it slowly. Thank you.
Hi, Jared. Thank you for your talk and sharing your ideas. You touched upon the illusion of consciousness. Could you say a little more about that and your views on what consciousness is, in the minute you have to answer? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, a big one. I would love to just slam you with a bunch of papers. That's just probably, I taught a course, we covered consciousness, so you can go look at my syllabus. Let me see. In terms, I think that AI systems could be conscious. I don't think that current AI systems are going to be conscious, at least how they look right now. I think that to be conscious, you need to have a much stronger causal relationship with the world that looks more like nervous systems, but does not have to exactly be nervous systems. I would be fine with aliens being conscious if they replicate a similar degree of function. And so that's my broad answer to the question. But I could name some different theories, and then your eyes would glaze over. So that's what I'll say.
What do you think about human dignity as in respect of big tech and stuff?
I like human dignity. I think it's a good thing. I think we should try to keep it. And how do we do so? I think is a big question. How do we have more plural visions of the future as opposed to kind of singular myopic ones? Maybe is one way to answer this question about human dignity. I also think that there is a lot of, we can do a lot of this for ourselves. We can recognize the value which we add, even though ChatGPT can write some very mellifluous prose, does not take away that ability from me. I can keep my dignity. There are many who don't have the material circumstances to afford the same opportunities that I do in my life. I think attempting to provide those kinds of circumstances would be good in increasing human dignity.
So how has this thinking affected your technical studies?
That's a great question. Well, I wrote a paper with some colleagues on pluralistic alignment as opposed to a kind of view of alignment which has a kind of average, attempting to incorporate more views into the AI systems which we're making. And then I do research on social common sense, value alignment, depending on how you look at it, which is, in a sense, attempting to formalize many of the loosey-goosey ideas which I described in this talk.
I have a question from the chat that I like. It's well posed here. Do you agree that love is an illusion? It's just what it seems. You follow the illusion and change reality.
Yeah, I agree. Love is an illusion. It's a great illusion. I strongly encourage its adoption. It changes over time. It's not exactly what it seems, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Consciousness is an illusion. Does that mean that we shouldn't have it? No.
Hey, Jared. Thanks for breaking my brain. So I wonder if you could say more about the relationship between hallucinations and kind of AI generated outputs as they relate to illusions. Is a hallucination an illusion? Does it lead to an illusion, or is that perhaps a less helpful connection to make?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Benji. So the question is about what is the relationship between hallucinations and language models when they kind of make something up and illusions as I've been describing it. I guess I think that the illusion here would be the illusion of knowledge as opposed, or the illusion of kind of perfection. That's maybe the illusion that I would name, and that there might be a continuum of such ability. There are oftentimes in the morning after I've stayed up very late that I blurt out the wrong thing in heated romantic conversations. For example, I might hallucinate. So I think that there's something real going on there, that this is would also happen in natural systems. So it's a good question. I encourage someone to do their dissertation on it. There's a question.
A question, another one from the chat that I like. Any ideas about how to put AI systems into interaction with human systems to maximize the role of positive, pragmatic disillusionment?
Yeah, this is a good question. How can we kind of use AI systems? I might think of language models as aids, kind of tutors. I also have a paper about this that looks at philosophy as a case study for critical thinking. How can we get language models to do critical thinking, to do philosophy? They're kind of poor at it right now because they oftentimes are trained to be very bland or to represent some kind of average. They don't take a good stance. If I have a paper and I want somebody to give good critiques, I want them to be coming from a certain position and to really express that position in their feedback. This doesn't quite happen yet. I think that you need to have this role playing, in a sense, to a greater degree. And there are some other traits which you might also want. So you can go on my website and look at the paper if you'd like. Thank you for the question.
Hi, I love all the work you're doing. How do you see illusions playing out in large systems that are currently impacting people? As an example, think like applying for a Visa credit card. What are those illusions that are happening in these systems where, companies like Visa would have tons and tons of data coming in? They're working on using AI. What sort of illusions are you seeing happening, or do you predict may come into play?
Gee, I don't know. The inner workings of credit card companies is a bit beyond me. I sit on hold and try to get them to approve these purchases. I feel like we've sat on hold for the bank for a variety of things, tried to, jam the numbers on our touch screens to get to the operator and talk to someone. This is more of a frustrating kind of Kafka-esque environment. I don't know if I would quite name this an illusion, but I imagine that will become much worse as we have little chat models that we have to talk to in order to describe our problems. Maybe the illusion here is that that we have to live by debt, that this is the appropriate approach to life, which credit card companies, it's a commercialization monthly of debt, but that's a hot take.
You mentioned that AI tends toward, quote, the average, probably because it's built from a huge amount of data. And you're really calling for, can we make AI that's more, quote, pluralistic? Do you think that requires a technological innovation, or just we should be querying it differently? How do we get there?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think it is both an architectural change in terms of how reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is a way that we really steer large language models like ChatGPT, the ways that we're trying to get the models to recapitulate the answers from literally an average. We get people to vote on which outputs they like the best, and we score the model more highly if it does highly on the average. So you could imagine changing this process so that you could sort of select different groups and attempt to perform well for those kinds of groups, have something more jury-like. Mitchell Warden has a great paper on jury learning, for example, from Stanford. But there's also more data necessary in order to get there. There was a good paper out called Prism that collects some of this. You basically can look at feedback, language feedback, from different kind of people, from more groups, from a broader swath of the world. I think both approaches are certainly necessary in making a more pluralistic AI system. Good question.
Thanks for the talk. I'm looking at the blurb on the book that says it's a meditation on what happens when artificial intelligence clashes with human stupidity. What can we do about human stupidity? How do we make people less stupid about AI?
That's a great question. I'm guilty of human stupidity, as I hope all of you should be as well. How do we deal with it? I look to the, social systems that we have created as humans, which attempt to reveal the better angels of our nature, as some have said. I think that there are similar endeavors necessary in order to use AI systems to reveal them. John Rawls, the philosopher, talks about the reflective equilibrium, for example, the set of positions that you would have on reflection, which you truly believe in. So not just the values that you write down at time step one, but after interrogation, when someone says, actually, you were a little bit inconsistent there. Having some kind of aid to point out our own inconsistencies to make me the better version of myself might be one kind of approach, like the critical thinking I described earlier. I'd love to see more work like that.
Thank you. My illusion is on agency and self-determination.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes when I use social media, I feel that I should be the one in control of the algorithm,
mm-hmm.
and not to accept the one of the monopolies that is imposing on me some decision.
Yeah.
But then I realize how much I can be in control and actually enrich my experience, how much my self-determination will be enriching when actually what enrich me is discover new things. And I don't know how to put a line between what I should decide and what is better to delegate to a higher collective.
Yeah, no, it's a great illusion. I'm somebody, for example, who doesn't use spell check anymore because I like to choose the ways that I am controlled. Obviously, I'm using a keyboard, I'm using the English language. There are biases that are constraining the actual things that I do, like you would online in terms of the content that you see. What kind of algorithms dictate what you want. Maybe the illusion is that we need this kind of self-determination, but I happen to like it. I think other people happen to like it. I think that the choosing what tools to wed ourselves to, what constraints are reasonable, it should be democratic in nature. But yeah, it's an interesting illusion. I appreciate you bringing it up.
We've touched on lots of big themes: love,
a very small one, actually. So thanks, Jared. I was just wondering on something you said during your talk. So you said we can get away a little bit from this idea of creating artificial intelligence. And I was just wondering of what you had in mind as alternatives. So would it be something like evolving or actually discovering, or?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The creation myth is very singular, right? And then on the seventh day, he rested, blah, blah, blah. Where in terms of the evolution of human intelligence and also the creation of AI, there's a lot more give and take. That we can do something about the process. There's not a single endpoint in optimum which we are necessarily converging on. There's a role for our voices. I think that's the positive gloss that I would give to it. I appreciate you bringing it up.
Maybe one more from the chat that I like. Jared, how are you so productive? Also, why are you pursuing the illusion of this thing we call a PhD?
Well, it turns out the PhD is very necessary in being a faculty member. So that's practically why. Also kind of fun. Then the illusion of productivity, I think, is an illusion. This is Swan what do you call it when the ducks are paddling and nobody sees their movement. I work on weekends. I shouldn't. I would say that's the answer.
All right, well, thank you, Jared, and thank you, everyone. Wonderful discussion.